You mentioned Jon Stewart. The two of you have a bit of a history. I don't know if you've seen it, but he kind of grilled your supermarket and Subway videos. Have you got a chance to see it?
I haven't seen it, but someone characterized it to me, which is why I pivoted against it early in our conversation about how the price of freedom is living in filth and chaos.
Yeah, that was essentially it. So in 2004, that's 20 years ago, Jon Stewart appeared on Crossfire, a show you hosted. And that was kind of a memorable moment. Can you tell the saga of that as you remember it?
I mean, for me, as I was saying to you before about how it takes a long time to digest and process and understand what happens to you, or at least it does for me. I didn't understand that as a particularly significant moment while it was happening. I just got off on a plane from Hawaii. I mean, I was out of it as usual. And I was very literal as usual. And so from my perspective, his criticism of me, to the extent I remember it, was that I was a partisan. Well, he had two criticisms. One, that Crossfire was stupid, which it certainly was. In fact, I'd already given my notice and I was moving on to another company by that point. Crossfire was stupid. Crossfire didn't help. Crossfire framed everything as Republican versus Democrat, whatever. It was not helpful to the public discourse. I couldn't agree more. And that's why I left. So that was part of his critique. Fair. I'm not sure I would have admitted it at the time because I worked there and it's sort of hard to admit you're engaged in an enterprise that's like fundamentally worthless, which it was. But his other point was that I was somehow a partisan or a mindless partisan, which is definitely not true. It is true of him. He is a mindless partisan, but I am not. And I really haven't been since I got back from Baghdad at the beginning of the Iraq War. And I realized that the Republican Party, which I'd voted for, my whole life to that point and had supported in general, was like pushing this really horrible thing that was going to hurt the United States, which in time it really did. The Iraq War really hurt the United States. And I realized that I had been on the wrong side of that. I said so publicly immediately from Baghdad. I said that to the New York Times and I really meant it. I mean it now. And so to call me partisan, you could call me stupid. You could call me wrong. I certainly have been wrong, but partisan, I just didn't think it was a meaningful, it's like, that's just not true. It's the opposite of true. So I didn't really take it seriously at all. And I never thought much of him. So I was like, whatever, some buffoon jumping around on my show, grandstanding. But I do think it was recorded. And by the way, that happened right at the moment that YouTube began. I think that was one of the first big YouTube videos. It was one of the first big YouTube videos. So it had a virality that, if that's a word, it went everywhere in a way that didn't used to happen in cable news. I mean, by that point, that was 20 years ago, as you point out. I've been in cable news for 9 years. So before 2004, we would say something on television and then it would be lost. Like people could claim they heard it, but you'd have to go to the University of Tennessee at Knoxville archives to get it. Suddenly, everything we said would live forever on the internet, which is good, by the way. That's not bad, but it was a big change for me. And I just couldn't believe how widely that was discussed at the time because I thought he was not an interesting person. I think he's obviously a very unhappy person. I just didn't take him seriously then, and I don't now. But so anyway, that was it. It was a smaller thing in my life at the time than other people imagine.
Okay, you said a lot of words that will make it sound like you're a bit bitter, even if you're not. So you said unhappy person, partisan person.
Unhappy guy. Well, he's definitely partisan for sure.
So can you elaborate why you think he's partisan?
Well, so I think that, and I see this a lot, not only on the left, but people who believe that whatever political debate they're engaged in is the most important debate in the world. And so they bring an emotional intensity to those debates and they're inevitably disappointed because no eternal question is solved politically. So they're kind of on the wrong path, right? And they're doomed to frustration if they believe that. And many do. He certainly does. That whatever the issue is so, Clarence Thomas should not be a Supreme Court justice. And the implication is, well, if someone else is a Supreme Court justice, we'll live in a fair and happy society. But that's just not, it's a false promise. So I think that people who bring that level of intensity to politics are by definition bitter, by definition disappointed, bitter in the way that disappointed people are. And that the real questions are like, what happens when you die? And how do the people around you feel about you? Those are those are not the only questions in life, but they're certainly the most important ones. Mm-hmm. And if we're spending a disproportionate amount of time on who gets elected to some office, not that it's irrelevant, it is relevant, but it's not the eternal question. And so I feel like he's not the only kind of bitter, silly person in Washington or in its orbit. There are many, and a lot of them are Republicans. So, but I just thought it was ironic. I mean, everything is ironic to me, but like being called a Russia sympathizer by a guy who calls himself Boris, like it just made me laugh. No one else has ever laughed at that. Boris Johnson's real name is not Boris, as you know. He calls himself Boris. It's his middle name. And so like, if you call yourself Boris, you don't really have standing to attack anyone else as a Russia defender, right? I think that's funny. No one else, as I noted, does. But Jon Stewart, like, if he, there are a lot of things you could say about me, but he's much more partisan than I am. So to call me a partisan is like, what?
He would probably say that he's not a partisan, that he's a comedian who's looking for the humor and the absurdity of the system.
That's a dodge.
On both sides.
He's a very serious person in this. I will say this, and he shares this quality with a lot of comedians. I know a lot of comedians. I know a cross-section of people just having done this job for a long time. And a lot of them are very serious, like about their views, and they have a lot of emotional intensity. And he certainly is in that category. He's not, that's like the silliest thing. Yeah, he's a comedian for sure. He can be very funny for sure. He has talent, no doubt about it. I've never denied that. But he's motivated by his moral views. This is right, that is wrong. And I just think it's a misapplied passion.
What do you think? I'm just a comedian is
I don't think any serious person thinks that. I mean, if you're just a comedian, and I look, I'm not trying to claim, I couldn't claim that I haven't said a lot of dumb things. And one of the dumbest things I ever said was when he was on our set lecturing me. He's a moralizer, which I also just don't really care for as an aesthetic matter. But he was lecturing me about something, and I said, I thought you were here to tell jokes, which I shouldn't have said, because he wasn't there to tell jokes. He was there to lecture me, and I should have just engaged it directly rather than trying to diminish him by like, you're just a little comedian. Well, he doesn't see himself that way. But I would just say this, Jon Stewart's a defender of power. Like, Jon Stewart has never criticized, like, what's Jon Stewart's view on, the aid we've sent to Ukraine, the $100 billion or whatever? Like, what happened to that money? What happened to the weapons that it bought? He doesn't care. He has the exact same priorities as the people permanently in charge in Washington. So whatever, he's not alone in that. So does Mika Brzezinski and her husband and all the rest of the cast of dummies. But if you're going to pretend to be the guy who's giving the finger to entrenched power, you should do it once in a while. And he never has. There's not one time when he said something that would be deeply unpopular on Morning Joe. That's all I'm saying. And so don't call yourself a truth teller. You're a court comedian or a flatterer of power. Okay, that's fine. There's a role for that, but don't pretend to be something else.
I'll just be honest that I watched it just recently, that video. And
from 20 years ago?
From 20 years ago. I watched it initially, and I remember it very differently. I remembered that Jon Stewart completely destroyed you in that conversation. And I watched it, and you asked a very good question of him, which was, and there was no destruction, first of all. And you asked a very good question of him. Why, when you got a chance to interview John Kerry, did you ask a bunch of softball questions?
Yeah.
I thought that was a really fair question. And then his defense was, well, I'm just a comedian.
So I thought that was disingenuous. And I haven't watched it. I never have watched a clip one time in my life. And I don't like to watch myself on television. I never have. So that's my fault. And I probably should force myself to watch it, though. Of course, I never will. But I think the takeaway for me, which was really interesting and life-changing, was I agree with your assessment. I've lost a lot of debates. I've been humiliated on television. I'm not above that. It certainly happened to me. It will happen again. But I didn't feel like it was a clear win for him at all. Maybe a TKO, but it was not a knockout at all. And yet it was recorded that way. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of weird. That's not what I remember. And then I realized, no, Jon Stewart was more popular than I was. Therefore, he was recorded as the winner. And that was hard for me to accept, because that struck me as unfair. You should rate any contest on points. Like, here are the rules. We're going to judge the contest on the basis of those rules. And No, in the end, it's just like the more popular guy wins. Every TV critic like Jon Stewart, every one of them hated me. Therefore, he won. And I was like, wow, I guess I have to accept that reality. And you do, like the reality of the sunrise. You just have, you're not in charge of it. So that's just what it is.
Unfortunately, it's a bit darker. I think the reason he's seen as the winner, and the reason at the time I saw as the quote unquote winner, is because he was basically shitting on you, like personal attacks versus engaging ideas. And it was funny in a dark way, and like making fun of the bow tie and all this kind of stuff. And like,
fair. Bow tie.
I understand.
And it was fair to call me a dick. I remember he called me a dick. And I remember even when he said that, I was like, yeah, I'm definitely a dick. Yeah, and that's not my best quality, trust me.
But also to be I thought Jon Stewart came off as a giant dick at that time, and I'm a big fan of his, and I think he has improved a lot. So
that may be true.
We should also say that like people grow.
I certainly have, or change anyway. You hope it's growth. You hope it's not shrinkage. But but
it is cold outside.
Yeah, I mean, look, I haven't followed Jon Stewart's career at all. I don't have a television. Like, I'm pretty cut off from all that stuff. But so I wouldn't really know. But the measure to me is, are you taking positions that are unpopular with the most powerful people in the world? And how often are you doing it? It's super simple. Not for its own sake, but do you feel free enough to say, to the consensus, I disagree? And if you don't, then you're just another toady. That's my view.
Well, I think he probably feels free enough to do it, but you're saying he doesn't do it.
On the big things, look, the big things, this is my estimation of it. Others may disagree. The big things are the economy and war, okay? Yeah. The big things government does can be, there are a lot of things government does. Government does everything at this point, but where we kill people and how and for what purpose and how we organize the economic engine that keeps the country afloat. Those are the two big questions. And I hear almost no debate about either one of them in the media. And I have dissenting views on both of them. I'm mad about the tax code, which I think is unfair. I don't think we should be, the fact we have a carried interest loophole in the tax code and people are claiming that their income is investment income and they're paying half the tax rate as someone who just goes to work every day. It discourages work. It encourages lending at interest, which I think is gross. Personally, I'm against it. Sorry. And the fact that we're creating chaos around the world, like, is the saddest thing that's happening right now. And nobody feels free to say that. So that's not good.